Hey, welcome back to Guardbeardia. I have the next chapter of the Veil Rider series for you. It's been a long time coming, but if you guys are in the Discord, you know what's going on. If you haven't joined the Discord, you probably should. We're always in there playing Among Us, talking about the news, updates, that kind of thing. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and hop in. It's a pretty chill place. And before we get into the chapter, be sure to stop by our first affiliate, the folks at Redcon 1. I know a lot of you have troubles, eating properly or eating the nutrition you should be getting because, life is busy and you can't always have the time to sit down and eat all the foods you need to eat. I personally have been using them to keep up my own nutrition while riding because I can more or less sit in one place and drink one of these MRE meal replacement shakes and not have to get up and cook and eat and do dishes and do all the other junk. I can simply write and sip. I get all the calories and protein and nutrients I need in one sitting, and I think you could use this as well. Life doesn't always allow you to eat the way you should, but at least you can drink the way you should with Redcon 1. Don't worry, it's food. Real food. Chapter 18.
Sprite! Fire Sprite! Get the fuck away from it!
The call echoed out across the battlefield, following a multitude of screams and the bellow of fire. Yule slid another magazine into his Beretta, the weary metal rasping in the well of the pistol while looking up and around, trying to figure out who was yelling. He squinted, and across from the burning LAV-25 he was using as cover, he could see auxiliaries and a few human NCOs running at a full sprint away from a small cluster of the same vehicles, most of which were smoking and surrounded by their unloaded infantry. When the LAV-25s had appeared right in front of their battle lines, they had been only yards away, and began opening fire as soon as his dragoons and Domino's companies turned to engage. Their casualties had been light, despite the charge down the trench network and into the midst of the advancing Bradleys. However, being in the open, with a line of more Bushmasters staring them down, spelled doom for more dragoons than Yule could bear. Closing the distance of less than 20 yards into withering cannon fire had skyrocketed casualties from 10% to almost 40% in a short matter of seconds, and the dead quickly piled up upon themselves in the charge. The Grimm's abacus calculations were swelled further by the spray of machine gun fire from coaxials, but his auxiliaries had covered the distance and began fighting among the LAV-25s and their offloaded passengers. Yule had rounded up a small platoon of Domino's troopers and his own D-Horse dragoons, leading them into a dive charge with Spittlejack rushing in beside him. They had caught two squads of chosen children as they were exiting out the doors of their vehicles, trying to push in on the blob flank of the main Veil Rider force and roll them up towards the middle. Yule initiated close quarters combat with a spare fixed blade knife in his Beretta, cutting down Southern Elves left and right as another Veil Rider NCO brained Elves with a trench shovel beside him. Yule could recognize Master Sergeant Cheeky Breeky Dolestav by just his usual outfit, as he had not been seen without his mask or a sharpened spade since he had come in through the veil in the first place. Master Sergeant Cheeky Breeky, while odd, was potent in close quarter battle, and helped keep both Yule and Spittlejack clear on their flanks as they pushed towards the LAV-25s to take them. To no one's surprise, Cheeky Breeky knew the ins and outs of the vehicle and clambered inside into the driver's seat once the crew's bodies were hastily removed. Cheeky Breeky turned the LAV-25 back on, clambered into the turret, pounded its partner vehicle with cannon fire until it bursted into flames, then shot out every smoke grenade that it had in its tubes. It was a messy affair, but Yule judged it to be a suitable application of the Bushmaster and the smoke munitions. Yule told Cheeky Breeky to rush the vehicle back to the trenches for safekeeping, then moved up to his freshly burning cousin to reload. The warning call of the fire sprite and the sudden gush of flames squirting out from the cluster of LAV-25s quickly grabbed Yule's attention when he got to the next LAV-25, and he formed the survivors of his ragtag squads around him. Spittlejack, we're going to creep in behind those trucks and wipe them out. Stay spread out and keep your eyes open. Try to avoid bunching up and making easy targets for the Elves. If you see them poking their heads out of the mortar holes, pin them down and chuck a few grenades at them. If you see the sprite, shoot him in the face. Spittlejack barked out a laugh. Well, that's not a very fancy plan, but it'll work. Fancy isn't really in my wheelhouse, Yule murmured, and hit the slide release on his Beretta, which rang slightly with the dwarven ammunition going into battery. His platoons moved in a large wing, Yule motioning for them to push out, and they crept forward slowly, cutting down any southern elves that ran out into their path and hauling away any wounded dragoons that were alive on the ground. The battlefield was a mess of vehicles hammering away with their turreted guns, the screams and thundering of horses, and the near-constant clash of weapons coming together in melee. A few squads of the smarter southern elves were packed in together and using their vehicles for cover, others running back and diving into mortar holes from barrages past, which either quickly filled with more southern elves, or screaming auxiliaries jumping into them with bloody bayonets gleaming. Yule shoved a female dwarf down to the ground and opened fire with his pistol as a southern elf rounded the corner, racking a pistol-grip shotgun and sending a load of buckshot whizzing over both of their heads. He heard someone cry out behind him, but didn't have time to look, putting 3 rounds into the elf's chest in quick succession. Hot brass bounced off his face and then rolled down the back of the uniform top of the dwarf below, who hissed as the scorching metal kissed her skin. The elf cried out, fired his shotgun wildly into the air, then toppled backwards onto the ground with a thump and jangle of gear. Eyes open, doorstop, Yule growled to the dwarf, and she blushed in embarrassment as she had been fussing with her weapon and never having seen the elf around the corner. Yule tilted his head as he heard a southern elf talking loudly in their eloquent dialect, and pressed the amulet to his head through the patrol cap. As he heard the words morph into English, he stalked forward, poking his head around the end of the LAV-25 and peeking into the passenger compartment. Buying you time. They're all fucking around us and no one ran like we thought they would. They just charged into the vehicles. We're going to be swamped within minutes. What do you mean they're only halfway done? You told us it'll be completed in— Oh gods, he's here! Yule lurched forward into the passenger compartment and snatched up the lone radio operator by his uniform top and shook him, knocking the rifle from his shoulder and kicking it across the seats he was using as a table for the radio. He roared down into the elf's face and pointed his Beretta at his nose. Done with what? Halfway done with what? The elf squawked in terror and ripped his pistol from his holster, rushing to bring it up to his temple and kill himself before Yule could. Yule had his hands full with uniform and pistol, and instead of letting go of either, pitched forward and grabbed the elf's wrist with his teeth. Yule bit down hard and felt the crackle of bones breaking under the pressure of his canines, hearing them snap like twigs in his skull. The southern elf howled in pain and the pistol thudded down to the deck, tumbling towards the door and then sliding down the ramp into the eager hands of an auxiliary. Yule spat flesh and blood from his mouth and brought the elf back up to his face, bellowing as bright blood trickled down his chin. What is halfway done? Tell me or I'll rip your goddamn throat out. The elf withered in Yule's grasp and began to cry openly as panic gripped him, sobbing in the grasp of the boogeyman himself. The Queen's Gateway is being moved. Yule froze and stared down at the elf, who closed his eyes and waited for the final blow. The elf screwed up his face, tears rippling down the corners of his eyes, awaiting the final attack that would end his life. But no blow came, nor the click of a hammer in the sudden blackness of death. His legs gave way and he crashed to the ground, Yule having released the iron grip from his uniform top. The southern elf wailed out in alarm and spluttered as he hit the ground, looking around in shock as he sprang back up from his back to a seating position. Yule was standing still, his face impassive and hard to read as he looked at the radio, the glowing faces giving a flicker every few seconds. It was a ruse. This was all just a delaying action to keep me from getting to the gate, Yule said hollowly, and he looked over his shoulder at the auxiliary standing behind him near the rear of the entry hatch. What do you mean, sir? A Brimtouch asked, walking up and grabbing the foot of the southern elf. He dragged the elf backwards and away from his thrown rifle, bringing him towards the auxiliaries with a swift jerk. The elf gave a short scream but silenced himself as the rest of the Yule's troopers glared down at him. Yule turned and walked out of the inner area of the LAV-25, sitting down roughly on the nearest edge seat with a rattle of shoulder armor on his battle vest. In the distance, he heard the roar of flame and the screams of the burned, as well as the gleeful cackle of a fae. If I had left Domino and gone straight to the gate, I could have dragged all 3 dragoon wings into it. Instead, they knew I wouldn't let Domino die and would try to assist him, making a logical sweep up through Sandrion. These Bradleys and LAV-25s are delaying action, nothing but a way to stall for time. Everyone watched on silently, and even the southern elf was looking, mouth agape, as Yule tossed his patrol cap on the deck of the LAV-25 and slid his Beretta into its holster. He ran the fingers of his rough hands through his sweaty hair and sighed. They've won the first leg of this war. They're going to move the Vale as far back as they can and set up in a more strategic location, ain't they, kid? Yule was looking down at the elf, who swallowed and slightly nodded. Yule shook his head a little and gave a short snort of bemusement. You lot are heartless bastards, I'll give you that. That fire sprite some sort of commander? The southern elf nodded again, looking around at the glaring faces of Yule's auxiliaries before he spoke out in English. He is Almer Tornellus, Colonel. Does he like challenges? The southern elf squinted in confusion, but nodded once. Good, Yule said in a low tone, and put his patrol cap back onto his head, sliding his fixed blade into a separate sheath. He stood and strode over the southern elf, who recoiled and shrunk away from Yule, but then looked confused again when Yule stepped out onto the grass of the battlefield and strode away, Spittlejack jumping down and striding in Yule's wake. As the two walked towards the high, cackling laughter in the distance, the southern elf swallowed thickly and placed his hands in his lap, looking up at his captors. Are you going to kill me? The brim touch from before barked at a laugh. Fuck no, we're gonna go watch. Here, come with us. This isn't going to be one to miss. The southern elf was dragged up to his feet, checked for weapons, then brought along with the group as they walked well behind Yule and Spittlejack. Almer Tornellus, Yule bellowed, and 3 platoons of southern elves whirled around in shock. Yule and Spittlejack had simply walked up into the middle of them, moving past those tending to the wounded or shouting in the radios for checks on other squads. All of their attention was focused to the front of their ramshackle position, and had no mind to place a rear guard, which allowed Yule to just amble right up into their midst. Other elves saw them on the way in, but seemed confused to see Yule just strolling along towards their commander, and actually waved back slightly when Yule held out a hand in greeting, as if to say, "Relax, we're not here to kill you." These elves had formed a kind of wagon circle with a number of LAV-25s, and a fair number of dead dragoons and auxiliaries were littered around their last stand position, mixed in with their own dead. They had even begun dragging shattered horses up to fill the holes where the hulls of the LAV-25s couldn't fully cover those inside, and many elves were huddled behind the carcasses, rapidly reloading loose shells into Stanag magazines. Dozens of gun barrels whipped around to aim at Yule's chest, but neither he nor Spittlejack even blinked, waiting patiently for the fire sprite to step down from the top of the farthest vehicle. The fire sprite had his wings fully unfurled and beating on the air, heat radiating from them as if they were made from the coals of a forge fire, eating away at the oxygen around them. They swirled and twirled with the colors of fire, the roaring reds, the flickering yellows, the umber oranges, and at the very tips of the multi-part wings were the glowing blur of blues and greens. To Yule, they reminded him of a dragonfly wing, but with 6 separate blades instead of the usual 4. They buzzed as well, like some kind of demented bumblebee, and he found the noise to be irritating, akin to the sound of a grasshopper thudding across your path. When he heard his name called out, the fire sprite turned from fleeing dragoons sprinting away to look down at Yule, who had crossed his arms, even with dozens of rifle barrels trained on him. The fire sprite's voice was flat American, as if he was something out of an old black and white movie. Oh ho! I never would have thought you'd have come directly to me. The fire sprite was average for his height, most sprites lucky to push past 5'3", and shared the normal aspects of his fey race. tidy, long hair that was collected into multiple ponytails that ran down his back, the color of which matched his wings, large almond-shaped eyes with red colorings all throughout around a slightly tapered pupil, and of course the huge wings that bore them aloft. Colonel Tornellus touched down to the ground with a loud, locust-like buzz of wings and held out his hands in greeting. "Well, well, Mr. Yule of Pleasure. I'm Colonel Almer Tornellus, Elder Sprite of the Ashul Tea." He bowed low, and to Yule it felt a bit mocking. Yule looked over the tips of his wings and saw that he had burned alive at least 30 of his troopers on his own, and he could smell the cooking flesh even from here. "I hope your troopers can remember the name for me," Yule said dryly, and Spittlejack gave a short chuckle. Colonel Tornellus's face gave a twitch and he stood back up, bringing his hands together in front of him, fingertips pointing towards the ground. "Well, anyway, it's awfully brave of you to just walk up here. Even more shocking you weren't shot on sight. Oh, there are more your lads now." Yule turned to look over his shoulder and saw that the platoons he had mustered were standing some feet away with their prisoner out front, and a few of his medics ushered forward, offering a few spare bandages to the Southern Elf medics. Yule saw that the old saying of combat medics still rang true, as the Southern Elf medics took them with a nod and began applying them to their own wounded. Any medical supplies are good medical supplies. Gunfire was still echoing and chattering around them, as well as the thump of belters from the auxiliaries, and Yule turned back around to the fire sprite. "I caught wind of your plan, and you've won. I'll never get to the Vale in time." At the words, Colonel Tornellus smiled and gave another short bow. "However." Colonel Tornellus's head shot up at the "however," and his face seemed suddenly unsure. Yule continued. "My lads and I will happily fight you to the death here, and those Himalayas will feast on the flesh of your lads and ladies tonight. You'll never make it out of here alive, and I do assume that was your plan. Delay to the death and fight for the seconds." "Yes, that was indeed the plan we hoped to fulfill, and it appears to have worked." "Right. Difference is, I'm tired of people dying. Always seems like wherever I go, I'm having to either kill some poor bastard or watch my own men die. I have dead troopers all over this field for nothing. It has all been for naught, and I won't gain a single fucking thing from it. You've completed your objective and secured the victory conditions for your mission. As far as I see it, there is little reason to keep fighting, and the annihilation of your forces will be nothing but bitter ash in my mouth." Yule drew out one of his crossed arms and pointed at a very harried radio operator, her hair frayed from her headset in the stress of battle. "Order her to call for a ceasefire." Colonel Tornellus cocked his head to the side, a bemused grin on his teeth, but he turned to the radio operator and nodded to her. She blinked and keyed up her radio, yelling into it just a tad too loudly.
"Ceasefire! Guide on! Guide on! Emperor Actual! All units, cease fire!"
When she was done, she looked up and around to the other confused Southern Elf soldiers sitting near her, back up into the eyes of Colonel Tornellus, and then to the eyes of Yule. Around the last stand position, the gunfire rumbled slowly away as if it were a thunderstorm rolling over them, and the two commanders didn't speak until the last clatter of gunfire chattered to nothing. The elven operator went back to her radio and began talking normally into it, relaying to anyone listening what had gone on to that point, and Yule could hear the thump and rustle of hundreds of boots coming their way. Even now, surviving Himalayan harpies came down around them, clicking down onto the top of vehicles or dead horses, their claws covered in gore and soaked in blood up to their knees. "So, Fey Colonel, I wish to issue a challenge." Colonel Tornellus's eyes flared up with excitement at the words, his wings giving a flutter at the thought. "A challenge?" "You're a dead Fey walking." Yule turned and looked around at the southern elves around him, both the wounded ones and the living. "You're all dead soldiers walking. You won't hold out much longer. We're in amongst you and we'll take you to close quarter battle until none of you are left to draw breath. Then the harpies will make a meal of you." That being mentioned, the harpies ringing around the southern elves all grinned with their wickedly pointed teeth, some of them even licking at the blood that already stained their lips. Colonel Tornellus leaned his head back, eyes hooded, and he played with the cuff of his left sleeve, the fabric smoking slightly at his touch. Ah, I see. Why suffer the deaths of a few hundred? We can only suffer the death of one. You win. You and your troopers head on home unmolested. Mine will do the same, and they will meet you on the field once again in the future. Plus, I'll be dead, and none of this shit will be my problem anymore. If I win, I take your troopers as prisoners and keep them away from the lot of you bastards. Colonel Tornellus closed his eyes and made a contemptful movement with his lips, holding his hands palms up. Why can't I take your soldiers prisoner? I don't think they will allow that, Fey Colonel. Colonel Tornellus snorted then laughed. Probably a fair assessment. This domino wouldn't even budge off the hill, and even dug down into it to make his point. Very well, Mr. Yule, name your terms. Yule didn't move, nor did he hesitate after the fire sprite had finished. To the death. That's it? That's it. Colonel Tornellus looked quite surprised at the absolute lack of terms Yule laid out, and looked around to the troopers that surrounded him. Well, I guess he'll be going home early then. Very well, Mr. Yule, let's make a space for ourselves. Move away from here. Leave the wounded to their dying. I'll meet you out in the middle. Staff Sergeant, clear all the wounded out of the main combat area. Go find Domino and Severus, let them know what's up. Also, would you mind lending me a weapon? Spittlejack flipped his axe up, letting it turn a few times before grabbing it by the back of the head and handing the handle towards Yule. I'd be honored, Commander. Yule drew out the golden-flecked blade of gore from its fouled sheath, holding it in his offhand in an ice-pick grip while taking the dwarven war-as in his main hand. Yule could use his Beretta in his offhand, but wasn't really in the mood. As he walked out of the last stand position and out onto the casualty-strewn field, he was actually in a right foul mood. He had lost a battle for the Vale, and the enemy was clear and free to move it wherever they wanted, having taken advantage of his care for his own troopers. His mood was so foul, in fact, that he reckoned that the only way to staunch it was to spill some Fey blood on this field and haul the body back as a trophy to Valhalla Hill. While he thought about it, he figured the wings would make as good a trophy as any. Southern Elf and Rider Auxiliary alike swarmed like worker ants to move wounded, the dead, or drag away dead horses to clear a dueling ring for the two commanders to perform in. Colonel Tornellus took the time to take off his uniform top and fold it, as if he intended to put it back on later, while Yule took off his patrol cap and tossed it to a nearby male Himalayan. The Himalayan plopped it onto his own head, figuring he could keep it warm for his commander until he was done with his duel. Yule then took out a bit of twine from his pocket and tied back his hair, bringing it back into a single strand at the back of his head. He needed his eyes clear, and did not want this Fey to burn his last patrol cap away. As the two prepared themselves, the ring of the circle filled with a mingling of races, all shoulder to shoulder, either sitting on the ground, standing around, or laying down on their stomachs, resting heads on rucksacks. Domino, supported partially by a bloodied Severus, trudged up to the ring as well. Severus had taken a few hard slashes across the chest and stomach, barely held in check by healing drafts. While Domino was missing a piece of one ear, his left eye was a bit of a mess and spat out one of his own teeth as Severus took a canteen from a nearby auxiliary. "What's fucking going on?" Domino murmured, taking the canteen after Severus took several gulps and held it out to him. A solitary female combat medic Yamato looked up, having pulled a spare healing potion out of her satchel for a wounded male Oni.
Commander Yule challenged Fire Fae to duel.
Domino squinted, water dribbling down his chin as he swallowed a mouthful of the canteen's contents. Well, that's pretty fucking stupid. Severus reached up and wiped away at his chin with a blood-covered wing claw, and Domino knew it was probably the blood of the elf she gored to death not even a few minutes prior.
Domino, darling, you are leaking your water. Hey, Private Medic, do you have any bone graft? He has teeth to grow back.
The crowd surrounding the two commanders continued to murmur and chatter like this for a few minutes until the two combatants in the middle settled, staring at each other. No one was interested in causing an issue for their commanders and distracting them from the duel, which caused most to give each other their space, or at least keep things amicable. There was a wide berth around the middle, as the fire sprite's fire magic could fly quite a ways, and Colonel Tornellus looked quite comfortable from where he stood, roughly 10 yards away from Yule. Yule looked as angry as he ever was when looking at a Fae, and the wind pulled at his beard slightly as it came across the battlescape. The two stared each other down, the crackling sounds of burning vehicles, the groans and moans of the wounded and dying, and the light hush of wind whirling around them being the only sounds they could register. Yule tilted his head slightly, seeing the Fae wiggling his fingers a little as if he were a doodless in a western, readying themselves for the draw. He's going to throw fucking fire at me. Why didn't I keep my pistol out? Yule thought, and slammed his knife back into its sheath around the same time Colonel Tornellus whipped up his palm. It was an awkward draw, but Yule managed to get his Beretta out and around the same time a ball of fire roared past his shoulder, the heat so intense that he felt his skin blister just from it being within a foot of the exposed skin of his neck. Yule hefted the Az and brought up the pistol, firing at the fire sprite in a steady pace as he sprinted towards him. Colonel Tornellus brought up his other hand, and Yule watched as the bullets impacted an invisible barrier, turning to molten metal and dripping down from the impact site as if they were warm honey hitting a hot pan. Cheater, Yule thought, and began to rapid fire, peppering the Fae with copper jackets as he closed the distance. Colonel Tornellus threw out his non-shield hand and let loose what looked to Yule like a horizontal tornado of flames, the sound a terrifying mix of a forest fire roar and a low tone of a tornado. It spiraled towards Yule, and he saw no other option than to chuck the pistol at the Fae and dive under the funnel of fire, rolling along the underside to pop out on the other side of it. The feeling made Yule wonder if it was what a pizza had to feel when running through a conveyor oven, and rolled onto his feet as he completed the dive. As Yule ducked and rolled, he was followed by a cloud of steam that rose up into the air behind him, the sweat and moisture from his body and clothes being flash-cooked away in the mist. Colonel Tornellus was grinning as he held out the funnel of fire, burning and blackening the grass where Yule had been standing, but a smile disappeared from his face as quickly as the water had from Yule's body. "What?" the fire sprite squawked, and brought his hands together, a thunderclap rippling through the air and booming towards Yule. Yule winced as the sound wave thundered over him, but kept his eyes open despite the protests of his instincts to close them. He was glad he didn't, as while the shock wave was noise at first, another wave of flame was whirling in the wake behind the concussion of air. It was slower than the fireballs, and he reckoned that it was to mop up whatever was dazed by the first strike. As it came towards him, Yule ducked low and shuffle ran towards Colonel Tornellus, who was sweating with the concentration of channeling two different spells at once. As he spotted Yule, wreathed in the steam of his quickly drying body and ducking under the fire wave, the fire sprite cursed and began to beat his wings deeply, the bass of the sound thudding the air and pushing away at the charred grass below his feet. Yule brought up the war axe from Spittlejack and drew out the gore knife on the run, flipping it around his hand and bringing it back into its ice pick configuration. Colonel Tornellus squinted his eyes at the blade, then flared them open with realization of just what Yule was planning to do. "Oh no, not me, not this one. I'm not going on that blade!" Colonel Tornellus roared, and brought up both hands, one forming into a small buckler shield of magical flame, and the other into a long sword composed of pure magical radiant heat. Yule didn't even halt his advance, and slammed his shoulder into the Fae's chest. Colonel Tornellus expected a slash or a weapon attack, and had brought his weapons up accordingly, but was caught half-footed by the sudden impact of Yule's armored shoulder into his sternum. Colonel Tornellus had lived all through the Middle Ages as a duelist, taking pleasure in dispatching humans folly enough to try and match blades. Centuries of leading the easy life and living mostly for the indulgences it had to offer had left him a bit rusty in his reactionary reflexes. The lack of keeping up his martial practice now blessed him with a broken clavicle from Yule's shoulder, and he wheezed, his wings beating rapidly to keep him balanced. Yule was unrelenting, and brought the Waraz up and then down towards the head of the fire sprite, who caught the blow on the dead center of the fire buckler. The edge of the bite became instantly cherry red with the heat of the contact, and the shield rang out with a magical twang as it fought back to thrice-forged clan steel. A dwarven edge, of course, could not be dulled by such trivial things as heat, and Yule ripped it away from the shield, trailing rivulets of flame that erupted into small hungry motes of fire on the ground. Despite the buckler, Colonel Tornillus had felt that blow and beaten his wings harder, wishing to get a height advantage above the tall human. As he rose into the air, Yule sniffed and whirled both his weapons once in his hands, then came down into a high ready stance with them both. Colonel Tornillus roared and flew at Yule, slashing with his radiant longsword, and sent a long whip of the very essence of heat at Yule. Yule decided to risk it, and let the whip of heat bounce off his standard issue shoulder armor, so that he could perhaps have the chance of grabbing the Fae by the foot. As he watched the metal heat and then melt, he thought that maybe he had chosen the wrong course of action. As the cooling molten metal began to burn through the lower elements of his armor and scorch his skin, Yule threw the Waraz at Colonel Tornillus, whose mouth opened in both surprise and his own horror. Standard issue armor for the Veil Riders was not dwarven clan steel, but normal steel made via the ways of the Valley Elves and Brim-touched, and Colonel Tornillus had seen his own flames melt the steel down to slag just minutes before Yule walked up into the last stand defensive area. He had judged that Yule would try to dodge it to conserve the human's armor, giving himself the advantage of both height and having a free slash or two at Yule. Instead, the human took the magical slash around the shoulder armor and embraced the molten metal dripping down onto his uniform. And now Colonel Tornillus was on a collision path with a human that could more than likely fold him into a pretzel. Colonel Tornillus put the brakes on with his wings, beating backwards as fast and as hard as he could to arrest his downwards ascent. But it was far too late to back out now, as he had to duck slightly to avoid the Waraz. With a shout of indignation and surprise, the Fae was grabbed by the polished black boot by Yule and whipped down onto the ground, the charred grass and dirt embracing him as softly as a rock would a clay pot. Colonel Tornillus felt two of his wings crumple and crack as he rolled, the light bones that made up their construction being rent apart as he was unable to tuck them in fast enough before the impact. He came up to his feet, wings askew, and coughed, a small trickle of blood pushing past his lips. He had bitten down hard onto his cheek when he met the earth, and now his mouth was beginning to fill with the trickles of gold-flecked crimson. Yule sniffed and tossed the gore knife to his main hand, bringing it low into a hammer fist hold and his other hand to a high guard. Colonel Tornillus stiffened, as he remembered this kind of stance back when he used to fight against German knights during the Teutonic Orders Wars. The Teutonic Orders had figured out they were being played, figured out he was doing it, and began to try and assassinate Fae after discovering a rudimentary way to tell who were Fae and who were not. Their toll of death on the Fae kind was still felt all the way to the modern day, and it was only by bribery, infiltration, and political subterfuge that they were able to turn the Teutons away. Plus, the Mongols really took them to the cleaners when it came to hiring fees. But the stance of Yule, the wild long hair tucked back into a single curly ponytail, the look of pure hatred in his eyes, it harkened Colonel Tornillus all the way back to the days in the German and Polish countryside, fighting against the formidable early Teutonic knights before they were watered down by Fae trickery. They had found power from something else that had come through the Queen's Gateway, and drew from it defiantly on their own crusade through Europe. They were men wreathed not only in steel plate, mail, and blade, but a conviction matched by none. That same conviction, that same power, radiated from the human in front of him, and he didn't like it. He didn't like it one bit. Colonel Tornillus lashed out again with the radiant long sword, and then threw his flaming buckler at Yule as he charged, his feet thudding rapidly on the ground as he sprinted. Yule decided the lash would be as fun as the last one and ducked it, the crackling whip of heat whirling away into the crowd of onlookers who had to dive out of the flight path. The flaming buckler bounced off his front armor plate and washed his mag pouches in licking fire, but Yule brushed them aside and strode forward towards the charging Fae. The flames were not nearly as scary as that whip of pure heat, and the scorch marks on his armor were superficial, if anything. Yule launched off his left foot into a two-step sprint before slamming into Colonel Tornellus, who, this time, was ready for the bodily slam and rolled with it, swimming under Yule's arm and avoiding the upward punch of the gore blade that was aimed for his chin. Yule felt the swim and spun on his heels, almost catching the Fae with his back swipe. The fight here was close, and when Colonel Tornellus moved his free hand up to use magic, Yule would slip forward under the hand and slug the Fae on the chin, or simply slap away the hand and bring up his knife to force the Fae to attack with his sword. It was a bit comical attacking a sword-wielding opponent with more or less a pommeled boot dagger, but Yule could tell that this Fae was rusty and feeling a bit dizzy after the third punch to the cheek. Colonel Tornellus was beginning to panic as his vision began to swim, and it was becoming harder and harder to keep the human in front of him. Colonel Tornellus landed 2 good swipes onto Yule, but the human would just hiss and riposte with his knife, the wound smoking and hissing as it boiled the exposed blood and cooked the flesh it touched. Deja vu began to strike him as he remembered the same thing happening in Poland, and only being stared death by mace to the nose when his footman had managed to stab the Teuton to death with spears. This time, however, there were no footmen, no spears, and only a very angry human with a small dagger that was slowly beginning to win. Colonel Tornellus had one last ace up his sleeve and swallowed in a gulp of air after parrying a slash from Yule. The air in his lungs combusted, and Colonel Tornellus's eyes watered as he held it in, waiting for the right moment to breathe it out, and went to spew it forth when Yule was recovering from the heavier parry. What Colonel Tornellus saw in his head was a gush of fire. The human breathes it in, perhaps singes his eyeballs, hair catches on fire as a distraction, any of which would lead to an easy win after he dispatched Yule with his sword. What he didn't see happening was Yule shoving his entire hand into his mouth to block the flames, and the Fae's heart paused for a few beats as he felt the human's filthy knuckles pass his rear molars. This was a thing that never happened, or at least was never discussed or seen. Fire sprites were well fire resistant on the outside, normally able to plunge an entire hand into a coal fire and come out with nary a mark. But what happened when the fire from their lungs was blocked? It was not a pleasant process igniting the fuel in their lungs and breathing it out, and it was seen as a last resort kind of trick, since it did cause a bit of irritation and could lead to voice loss. But it was never known for anything to ever block the exit for the flames. Colonel Tornellus felt panic, and his flight response coursed down his nerves as the flames retreated back down into his chest, and sat there, burning inside of his lungs. His heart began to cook. The flesh of his esophagus began to blacken, and the pain was like nothing he had ever felt before. Yule, of course, thought the Fae was going to explode, which would have been spectacular by his reckoning. But instead of this, he felt his knuckles begin to blister and saw that smoke was starting to pour out around his fist and out of the ears of the Fae in front of him. Ah, it appears we are not fireproof after all. He's going to cook me from inside out. Good show, Colonel Tornellus thought, and his organs began to blaze. Fire took to his heart, his lungs, his stomach, eating all the way down his tracts and charring him from the inside out. This fire, this magical fire, did not want to feed off of just air, but magic. With no more air to have, it instead attacked the only fuel source it had left, the blood and organs of the magical thing that had ignited it. Colonel Tornellus choked out around Yule's fist, dropping the radiant blade and clutching Yule's forearm with his hands, but Yule was unyielding, looking down at the Fae with furrowed brows as he was burned from the inside out. Only when Colonel Tornellus's eyes started to blister and blacken, his hands going slack, and bubbling fluids beginning to hiss out from his ears, did Yule decide it was enough and brought the blade across and through the side of his temple. dispatching the Fae with steel to his cooking brain. While Yule hated Fae, the colonel dueled him to end the fighting. He could make this one suffer a little less, even if he did not truly deserve it. Unknown to Yule, Colonel Tornillus was grateful for the mercy, having heard the hiss of the blade coming from the side of his head, as his eardrums began to boil from the heat building up inside his body. The magical heat had been feeding off the very magic in his blood, and he would have had a lot longer to die if Yule hadn't dispatched him as soon as he did. The metal rang as it punched through Colonel Tornillus' skull, and when Yule pulled it out, the metal was smoking from the heat, baking the gold flecks into the broad face of the blade. Yule ripped his hand from the Fae's mouth, his skin blistered and burned to the 3rd degree, but the feeling was dulled by the nerves being cooked away down in the Fae's throat. Colonel Tornillus' body ragdolled to the ground, curling up on itself as the fire ate away at the interior of what was left of it, and smoke began to pour out of any place it could escape, whether it was from the nose or a fresh new hole in the flesh. Those around Yule were silent, but when he turned around to hail a medic, he saw that while half of his viewers were looking on in a positive way, all the southern elves were stricken. No auxiliary moved to disarm them. No one racked a weapon and began cutting them down. They all just stared on at their iron commander. 2 medical sergeants rushed out from the crowd and began pulling out healing salves, at which Yule held out his heavily blistered hand and did his best to straighten out his fingers. As the medics slapped on gobs of what looked like glowing beeswax and began wrapping it in fresh linen, Yule looked up and addressed those around him. "Who is your highest-ranking officer, chosen children?" Southern elves looked around and began talking to each other, their voices hushed and hands clutched to their rifles. After a few minutes, a female southern elf walked out from the larger throng of southern elves, down from where Colonel Tornillus had started the duel. Yule grinned with his canines out and turned as far as the medics would let him, hearing her walk out from behind him. Despite her southern elf heritage, she looked less fine-boned than her brethren, and her ears, while not as high-angled, were far longer than any others he had seen before. She had bright copper hair that shimmered in the light of the sun, and her eyes were almost pearl white, flecked with little sparks of orange, as if a chef had zested a citrus fruit onto a pair of white plates. Her face reminded him of someone back home, and he slid his gore knife away into its sheath before placing the hand on his hip. "I have to say, you look mighty familiar. You got a sister?"
Had a sister,
the elf said, and her voice was rugged in comparison to Fadithus' high, arrogant tones. "Your last name Fadithus like her?" The elf's mouth parted slightly, and she walked forward quickly a few more paces, her face losing its put-upon stern look and gaining one of hope.
Have you seen her?
"Yeah, she's alive. We're not friends. What's your rank?" The southern elf smiled for a beat before wiping it from her face, standing tall and defiantly in front of the human. She may be only 5'9", but she was going to make every inch count, even if she had to raise up on her heels.
I am a captain of the Queen's 13th.
From Yule's side, an Oni whistled in a mocking tone, in which all the Himalayan harpies nearby whistled in return before they all broke down into cackling laughter. The southern elf captain's face flushed red with indignation and she bristled visibly. The southern elves were not the biggest fans of harpies, as unlike their valley elf cousins, they were far easier to fly away with due to their lighter body builds. It was not unknown in the histories for harpies to freely hunt on southern elves during times of strife, migration, or lack of wartime activities to keep them preoccupied. Yule cleared his throat while looking pointedly at the harpies, and they all coughed into their wings, keeping their mouths hidden as they continued to smile toothily. "Captain Fadithus, I lied when I said I was going to take you prisoner." Captain Fadithus stepped back, her boot crunching on the blackened grass, and a ripple of panic erupted around the gathering of bodies. Southern elf soldiers were looking back and forth, some even bringing up their weapons at a low ready, prepared to fight to their last if it came to it. Yule saw, and Yule approved. "I'm not going to take you prisoners, or even kill you. What do you have left? Maybe half a company, a few battle-worthy platoons? You were sent here to delay me, to die to the man." Yule turned slightly to look at his troops. I am these troopers' commander, and I am here on the field. Where are your commanders? Those who would send you out to your deaths with nary a second thought, and only spare a single of their kind. I knew I was sending my lads out here in the thick of it, in the risk of it, and I knew I had to come with them. What did yours think? Captain Faditha set her jaw, her eyes dagger-like as they stared at Yule.
We had to keep you from getting there. That is what we were told.
And then what?
And then what?
She said, and seemed taken aback.
What do you mean?
Were they going to send help? Captain Fadithas turned to look at the radio operator from before, who shrugged, and then to a first lieutenant who shook his head from side to side. No answer to give. She turned back to Yule, whose medical sergeants were finching up with his hand. Yule gave his fingers a little wiggle to see how fast the salve was working, and raised his eyebrows in surprise. The pain was coming back in hot throbs, but that meant it was somehow healing his nerves back to full working order. While he flexed his hand, he walked towards Captain Faditha slowly, looking around the torn-up ground of the battlefield. His auxiliaries and human NCOs moved up with him, striding proudly behind as Southern Elves ducked and ran towards their own on the other side of the dueling ring. Colonel Tornellus was nothing but ash now, and had long since blown away in the wind that washed across the open field. Yule gave all the Southern Elves time to gather, seeing they were some shy of a full company, and far less than they had arrived with. Yule had to imagine, as he counted all the burning vehicles and the hundreds of dead littering the outside of the ring, they came into the battle a way short of what Yule brought, and were now whittled down to just these combat-abled. Were they going to send help, to get you out once the veil was moved, Captain Fadithas? Yule kept his face neutral, but was now standing right in front of her a few feet away, and slowly crossed his arms. She looked away, just past Yule's hip, and pursed her lips together, mulling over what she wanted to say until she looked back into Yule's eyes.
No, I suppose they weren't. We were told to hold for every second we could spare.
A tactic that won them their victory. But at what cost, Captain Fadithas? I rode out of my way to bail out one of my subordinates. Best friend, actually, Domino called out, and Yule heard Severus giggle. And best friend, and his troopers. It may have cost me this victory, but they will all mostly be going home. Always would have been. While you would have been cooling off in a mass heap in one of those mortar holes. Yule nodded towards a larger crater, and while she did not look away, a good portion of the Southern Elves looked over towards where Yule had nodded, and saw many give a shudder. They also shelled their own troops, just to try and kill me. I have a friend of mine back at my base that could attest to such. My quarrel's not with you, Southern Elf. I realized that when I killed a young lad and saw the fear in his eyes. You folk are as much as a victim as my troopers. The elves that died in that artillery strike, and even that poor kid that was told to guard a picket on the wrong night. My quarrel is with the Fae, and I want to offer you a choice. Southern Elves brought down their rifles, some even placing the buttstock on the ground and gripping the barrel as they stared on. The female radio operator looked around hurriedly as everyone brought down their arms, and she took off her headset, her hay fraying out around her long pointed ears. You can go back on your own, and we won't chase. We have things to prepare, and a good friend of mine is working on something special, something you won't enjoy. Southern Elves looked at each other, confused, while Captain Fadithas raised her chin slightly, eyes hooded.
And the other?
Simple. Follow me home. Yule smiled, uncrossed his arms, shrugged while holding out his hands wide, and turned his back on Captain Fadithas. Any vehicles that are drivable, get them running and back up to the trench network. Gather all the horses that are still walking and bring them back too. Gather the wounded into the trucks and haul them back, then gather all our dead. We're burying them at the hill. Jesus Christ, Domino, what happened to your face? I tripped on this dummy thick harpy.
Don't be so rude, Domino. I told you I was sorry. I had to take care of Elf that was rushing you from behind.
Captain Fadithas was bewildered, and only had a moment to stammer out a choked sound before Yule was swallowed up by his NCOs and other chains of command. The enemy turned and busied themselves with their orders, some lowering down dead drivers to idle Southern Elves so they could try and get their LAV-25s restarted. Captain Faditha spun around to look at the survivors of the Queen's 13th, and they were as lost as she was. Some of them barely functioning, walking wounded, and others gasping out their last breaths from where they lay on the ground further in the distance. She turned back around, trying to see Yule, but was instead greeted by a small staff of medical personnel who dropped off spare satchels of supplies. Captain Faditha tucked a few loose strands of hair that escaped her hair bun back behind her ears and pursed her lips again, staring down at the bags of healing drafts and fresh salves. She stood there for a few moments before turning around and addressing her surviving troops.
Destroy that radio and grab these bags. Let's get our wounded able to move.
There were quite a few vehicles still in working order, some of them blessedly being a pack of less than fair Bradleys, the majority being LAV-25s, with most of their crews being mulched by Belchers having piled out the run. The Southern Elf survivors had retreated into the woodline to discuss what they were going to do, and left the forces of Yule to do their work. The dead outnumbered the living by a margin that made Yule sick to his stomach, and the patches pulled from their uniforms filled multiple empty medical satchels. But he didn't feel good leaving them here or burying them in the trench network. These fallen, he was taking home the rest, as they had at least earned that respect. Even the Southern Elves didn't deserve to lay in the holes here. Surviving dragoon horses were hitched to wagons brought in by Domino that were stored far into the woods to avoid getting damaged by artillery or attacks, and the bodies were stacked upon these for transport. Harpies were flown to Valhalla Hill with news of their defeat and to ready the details Yethus had drummed up, while other Harpies were sent on straight to the main cities and holds of their allies. Everyone would have to know the Vale was moving and to prepare for the worst. When all the bodies were loaded and everything was ready to go, Yule began sending vehicles and wagons on a long trail back home. He was sitting on top of the LAV-25 that Master Sergeant Cheeky Breeky had snatched up with Domino and Savarus, the three of them chewing on field rations, sucking down health drafts, and discussing their wounds. Savarus was boasting about her new scars and saying they were great marks of pride, while Domino was grumping about his eye. While his teeth were grown back bright, pearly, and white, and some of his missing ear had returned, his eye failed to recover and was now covered with a spare wrapping of linen. Yule flexed his offhand, the skin a bit tough still, and remarked on how it looked. Looks as if I kept it out in the sun too long. Gonna be red like this till I die, I reckon. Domino chuffed. Well, at least he won't be looking like a cyclops. Savarus leaned on him and kissed his filthy, blood-stained shoulder.
Don't worry, I have seen far uglier cyclops.
Domino tried to look angry, but his smile betrayed him. Yule made a disgusted sound and scooted away from Savarus a few inches, who made a soft, playful hiss at him. His skin crawled regardless, and he grimaced at her openly. Auxiliaries filed past below in formation, most of them talking about the day or their time in the trenches, and appeared to be in good spirits despite the defeat dealt to them by the Fae. As the companies filed past, a fresh face came up over the lip of the trench, and the copper hair of Captain Fadithus was like a beacon. Yule waved at her while Master Sergeant Cheeky Breeky glared from the driver's seat, giving the engine a little rev. Yule leaned down and tapped the human on top of his stylized stall helm. Let's not flatten our guest, Cheeky Breeky. He leaned back up and slid down the front of the vehicle till his feet were able to dangle down, and Captain Faditha stepped forward, stumbling over a bit of loose trench before regaining her footing.
Mr. Yule, where are our dead?
Yule popped a dry blueberry into his mouth. I'm taking them to be buried. You don't need to worry about them. Captain Fadithus eyed him, but nodded, scuffing her boot over the dirt and sending a few harder pieces skittering across whatever grass was left.
I've made a decision.
Oh, Yule said, chewing and tossing another blueberry into his mouth. What would that be? Captain Fadithus turned and stared back down towards the battlefield, where vehicles still burned or smoked, and then turned back to Yule.
I want to see my sister. I'm bringing the survivors of the 13th as an honor guard.
Yule chuckled, tossing a few more blueberries into his mouth before bowing slightly and holding out his arms wide. By all means, I welcome you as guests. Feel free to travel with me in this truck and have your people fold into mine. She seemed unsure, but whistled out over the hidden slip of the forward trench. In a tidy column, a formation of Southern Elves marched forward, flying their colors proudly and all their rifles at shoulder arms. Yule's troopers slowed to let them weave into the long file on the road, and their banners snapped and waved alongside the rest of the companies that walked along. the wind playing along the battered and blackened fabrics. Yule watched Fedithas as her eyes trailed her company, and when she looked up to him, Yule was smiling softly and holding out the bag of dry blueberries to her. So, tell me about the sister you know. And that's the end of this chapter of the Veil Riders. If you enjoyed the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you know the channel so you know when the videos are released through the week. I'm leaving that gaff in, shows I'm human. Additionally, I have the Unicorn Waifu patch in for production. It's going to be expensive, but I got to get it done. And then profits from that patch will fuel a resupply of the regular Veil Rider unit patch. Additionally, the next chapter will be the last chapter of this book. Book 1 will be completed in the next video. That'll be the last chapter of the series. And after that, I'm going to begin going through this book, double checking, reworking paragraphs, rewriting a few things here and there, and then while I'm doing that, I'm going to be writing the second book, and then the next video is going to be the second book, Veil Riders Mark II, or whatever the hell I want to call it. And yeah, and in that story, I'm going to try to give the Beldam more leg room to work with a female character. That way, you guys will have more male-female duet interaction in the story. It seems you guys like having male and female voices, for your listening pleasure, and I think that's a really good idea to have. And I'm really enjoying working with the Beldam. She really is crushing it with the Emily Braun series, and I figured, hey, why not have more? Yeah, so we're almost done. The first leg of Yule's journey is almost complete, and you guys have been here the entire time, and I cannot undersell how much I appreciate all of you being here, listening to the story, donating, sending me gifts, that kind of stuff. It's been a real blast, and I cannot wait to keep this train rolling. I really can't. Be sure to check out Skull Splitter Dice, Redcon 1 MRE, and until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Guard Bro. It's been the Beldam, and this is Guardbeardia.